Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, guests, students here at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. I'm delighted to welcome you to a very important, but no doubt very difficult conversation about a topic and about an issue that has been on all of our minds these past weeks, months, ever since the world in which Israel studies and the world in which Israel and the Jewish world more broadly conceived has been finding itself since October 7th. My name is Csaba Nikolényi. I'm director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. I'm also professor of political science at Concordia University in Montreal, where I am greeting you from. It's my pleasure to bring to you an esteemed scholar and also dear friend, Dr. Donna Divine Robinson, who is going to tell us about her views, about her insights on Gaza, the war over words, and over who rules Palestine. Now, in a few moments, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the connection between this topic and Donna's research. But before I would do that, please, I'd like to ask for your indulgence to share, but just a tip, if you will, of the mountainous iceberg that Donna's scholarship and very accomplished intellectual biography is. Dr. Robinson Divine is the Morningstar Family Professor of Jewish Studies and Government and Professor Emerita at Smith College, where she taught courses on Middle East politics. Donna is fluent in several languages, Hebrew, Arabic, Turkish, and thus she's able to draw on material from a vast range of sources. Her books have included Women Living Change, Cross-Cultural Perspectives, Politics and Society in Ottoman Palestine, The Arab Struggle for Survival and Power, Post-Colonial Theory and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and Exiled in the Homeland, Zionism and the Return to Mandate Palestine, and Word Crimes, Reclaiming the Language of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. This latter volume was actually, and it started as a special issue, a special publication on the pages of the Journal of Israel Studies, the foremost intellectual outlet for scholars and researchers who are engaged in the study of Israel. Dr. Divine Robinson was co-editor of the journal for a long time together with Professor Ilan Tron. Dr. Divine Robinson had visiting professorships at Harvard's Middle East Center, at Yale University, the University of Sydney, University of Hamburg, and the University of Geneva. She was named Smith College's Engel Lecturer in the academic year 2012 and 13 in recognition of her scholarly achievements, and she was also designated as Smith College's Honored Professor for the excellence of her teaching. Donna is past president of the Association for Israel Studies. She held this honorific title from the years 2017 to 2019. And last, but certainly not least, Donna was named to Allgemeiner's 2019 list of the top 100 people who positively influence Jewish life. It is such a pleasure and truly a delight that, Donna, you were able to accept our invitation, even though we cannot greet you in person and share with you a little bit of this, of the warm hospitality that our institute and our community can usually offer. We take what we get, and we are no less delighted to have you with us on the screen.
Thank you for the opportunity to do this. October 7th, it's not clear how October 7th and the war in Gaza will end. Even at this point, we can't talk about all of the configurations, but we know what it was. October 7th was a savage attack against Israelis living in land that had been part of Israel since the 1949 truce agreements. It wasn't part of the areas conquered in the 1967 war. It was area that was considered Israeli. The savage, the atrocities that were documented not initially by Israelis, but documented by the perpetrators who filmed on camera, who talked about it, who talked about what they how they tortured Israelis in settlements along the so-called Gaza envelope, and were very proud of the attack. And the attack was shocking both to Israel and to, I think, the world, partly because Israel was considered a symbol of military technology, military competence. And so the fact that the military and intelligence failed to protect so many of the citizens there was something I'm going to talk about at the end, how it was and is understood in Israel. But it was something that I think everyone was surprised, and it was difficult to assimilate initially. And the first, some of the initial descriptions of what happened compared the Hamas attacks against Israelis to the attacks by ISIS against Muslims or Yazidis or Christians in Mosul in Iraq, and then in Raqqa in Syria. And so there was the sort of expectation that Israel had to respond, and would respond in a way that was similar to the way the Americans and other allies responded to against ISIS in those particularly in those two cities. And the responses by America and the allies in those two cities was brutal. They killed lots of civilians. There are today, by the way, the children of ISIS, one ISIS parent or another. There's some 40,000 kids living in a kind of prison in Mosul who are subjected to all kinds of attacks and assaults, including sexual assaults. But those attacks did not trigger demonstrations across the United States and across Europe, across Canada, talking about American attacks as genocide, talking about the innocent civilians killed. There was no one standing in front of the White House immolating himself because of the American role in helping Israel, presumably, perpetuate a genocide. So what should have elicited sympathy and did initially, that the currency of sympathy was quickly depleted. And you see, almost instantly, 36 Harvard student organizations say Israel is the only one to blame. So there was a sense in which a whole set of organizations in the United States not simply justified those attacks, but actually celebrated those attacks. by any means necessary. They were considered an expression of resistance, liberation, an attempt at liberation, even to the point where you have the kind of slogan that rape is resistance. There was, even when the United Nations documented or confirmed the documentation that there was rape, the UN envoy for against sexual violence said that finding some hostages were victims of sexual violence doesn't justify Israeli attacks. This is one of those examples when late isn't better than never, I think. So the question is, why was this turned around so completely against Israel? And I think that is the kind of explanation that I'm going to try to focus on, because Israel was considered not only a symbol of technological advancement, the startup economy and all of that, it was also considered an avatar of occupation. Even though in 2005, Israel ended its occupation of Gaza and only instituted what we now know was a very ineffective blockade because of the violence that emanated once Gaza was taken over by Hamas in 2007. So the notion that somehow this attack was going to free Palestine from the river to the sea, whatever that meant, was something that requires some explanation. And we know that the focus, the exhilaration, the first indication of support for these attacks came on university campuses. Where the notion was that this was an exhilarating event. This is what liberation looked like, some professors said. And it's important to note that this was an embrace of resistance that was more than what we scholars call performative. That is to say, we can often hear on college campuses when a lecture begins or some discussion begins, there's an apology for a building or a university taking over the land of Native Americans or occupying the land of Native Americans, but no one is seriously proposing that Columbia University dismantle itself and give its land and buildings to a Native American group, or the same with Harvard museums or Yale museums. But the non-performative act of redoing history was directed and is being directed at Israel. 75 years or more than 75 years of existence as a state, that the way we social scientists measure success, population growth, standard of living higher, people really being satisfied, part of the state, all of those markers of success are dismissed by these protesters, and the thrust of support for the Hamas atrocities was intended to change history, to rewrite history, to dismantle a state, and it show that this can be done by enough brutality unleashed against the population. So it's important to understand that most Israelis saw this attack as not a function of the '67 war, not a function of one or another policy, but as having echoes of 1948. This was an existential kind of battle. And the question is, why did so many groups on and off campus turn this savagery into sympathy for the Palestinians? The Palestinians themselves are considered the ultimate example of a people characterized and marked by displacement, expulsion, and weakness. And so if you're thinking about social justice and bringing more to people who've been deprived, the Palestinians stand at that intersection of people. Hence, the Palestinians are the result, or described as the result of the Nakba, or the catastrophe of 1948. The war that brought liberation and a state to Israel, in Palestinian historiography, brought to them a disaster. Now, Nakba is an interesting Arabic word because it comes originally from a word to describe catastrophes, a hurricane, an earthquake, some disaster. And it was introduced into Palestinian contemporary discourse, or into Arabic discourse, by a Syrian professor who taught in Lebanon, Constantine Zurek, and he introduced it in the 1950s after the debacle of 5 Arab armies losing to what was considered a very small state in the 1948 war. And Zurek introduced it really as a tool of analysis. What was wrong with the armies? What was wrong with the fight? Why did the armies lose? But the word really changed to mean, it was adopted by Palestinians to mean a kind of weakness, deprivation, loss of political agency. So that for Palestinians themselves, it's very difficult when you talk about the two-state solution, or this solution, or that resolution of the conflict. What they're thinking of is a displacement and dislocation coming from 1948. So their collective identity is so broken, it can only be restored by a kind of redemption from history. It means that the Nakba has moved Palestinian thinking away from this territory or that territory, away from material kinds of things to be able to resolve the issue, into a kind of amorphous set of goals that restore dignity or restore wholeness. They're things that can't be measured, and hence things, they're characteristics that the Palestinians hold on to because it defines their collective existence. Hence, the Palestinians found it possible, if not easy, to engage and enter into alliances with all sorts of oppressed groups. The Palestinians are the ultimate example of being oppressed, of having, presumably, so the story goes, of having the foot of Israel stamping on their own ability to restore themselves. So that's why Palestinians, through what they call intersectionality, have engaged in alliances with other oppressed groups. And I think that has given wattage to the kinds of demonstrations that American cities, American universities, Canadian cities, and European cities have seen as a result of Gaza. When you embrace the savagery of Gaza, you've taken on or you've accepted the legitimacy of very relatively violent protests. It's not, it's protests that draw attention to the cause, and it's protests that tell universities that anything is justified in terms of resistance. And so we've seen Jewish institutions defaced. You see on college campuses Jewish professors harassed, Jewish students harassed, Israeli lecturers on Israel or Israeli lecturers closed down. I mean, you know that, but there's a justification for that because the notion is you're helping to bring a certain kind of redemption to the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian leadership, the national leadership, has wrapped itself around a cause rather than a national movement that's seeking material benefits. And this has a long history. If people raise it in the Q&A, I'd be able to give you some of the historical background. But let me go to why or how this has all been put together. Because it's been put together pretty much initially on college campuses. And of course, college students graduate. So the influence of this kind of thinking we see in a host of cultural institutions, from newspapers to legislative assistants and positions in government, art, the arts, museums. This is a view that has come initially from the universities. And let me, so initially, it came uh, from notions of colonialism. Some of you may be familiar with Edward Said's Orientalism. The notion was that colonialism was the great moral monstrosity in the world that hadn't been addressed, and that colonialism was sustained, if not initiated, but heavily sustained by discourse, by literature, by texts. And so if colonialism was sustained by texts, then certainly colonialism ought to be able to be dismantled by texts and discourse. It was an argument that academicians found very appealing because, number one, academicians deal with discourse all the time. Even if you're dealing with other things, you have to get on the level of discourse. Secondly, it meant that academicians outside of the area of Middle East might be able to join in this endeavor, in a mission to weaken, if not uproot, colonialism. But that too became more fully developed by scholars who thought that there really are varieties of colonialism, and one obvious and attractive subheading of colonialism was something called settler colonialism. Settler colonialism was a notion that initially had to do with the United States, or colonists coming to the United States or to Australia or New Zealand, encountering indigenous groups, and ultimately finding ways to either obliterate the indigenous groups or certainly uproot them from their lands and confiscate their lands. So the idea of attaching settler colonialism to Zionism first began when the word colony and settlement was used historically by Zionists. Never mind, it bore no historical relationship to what the Americans did or the British did in Australia or these other cases, because Zionists weren't sent out from a capital or a major European colonial power to settle a new land or to expropriate and exploit the resources of a new land. They went to live and create a new culture. But the idea was that they called what they established colonies. So that that began a focus. But then settler colonialism began to develop not simply as historic events of people being sent from a country out to settle a land, but it began to be redefined as a condition. So settler colonialism today is a condition affixed to Zionism and Israel. And it encompasses the notion that whatever uh, the Zionists or Israelis do is tantamount to expressing settler colonialism, and that means pursuing genocidal policies, erasing the indigenous population, practicing apartheid. But it's a condition. It can't be proved with anything material. Now, if we step back for just 2 minutes, colonialism was appropriated in a kind of Marxian ideology, not only by the many of the essays, newspaper essays of Karl Marx, but then Lenin and Stalin. But colonialism originally had a concrete meaning. It talked about specific countries, specific policies. Remember that in 1948, Israel was able to defend itself, was able to expand the land that was originally given to it or assigned to it by the UN partition resolution, because no less an authority on colonialism then, Joseph Stalin thought that creating Israel was a blow against British imperialism. And so Israel was able to manage its war of liberation with Soviet arms or with Czechoslovakian arms that were ordered through the Soviet Union. America did not provide weapons to the Zionists and the early Israeli state. So colonialism has morphed into settler colonialism, which again has no firm, concrete, material meanings. And so also settler colonialism supposedly deprives Palestinians of political agency. The reason they're innocent victims is they have no power. Now, ordinary Palestinians lack political agency, but it has absolutely nothing to do with what Israel has done to them. So let me just draw a parallel. The reason for the establishment, or the reason for the Zionist idea, the molding of the Zionist idea, came out of the notion that you wanted to give Jews political agency to protect their collective nation, their collective culture. Leon Pinsker, who in his auto-emancipation wrote the first so-called Zionist tract before Theodor Herzl, really talked about the necessity for creating a movement, a collective movement that would protect the Jewish collectivity. Don't allow Jews to have to combat anti-Semitism or combat threats or combat attacks as individuals. You need a collective agency where people, ordinary people, not rabbis, not religious clerics, ordinary people make the decisions for their lives. They may make the wrong decisions, but they live with the consequences. And so if the decisions are wrong, they can correct them. Frantz Fanon, who's often cited as the reason why Palestinians have exploded in a rage against Israel, and who wrote The Wretched of the Earth. The Palestinians are the ultimate wretched of the earth, and so they've exploded in a rage in violence. Um, and so there, if you read Fanon's first chapter on violence, he talks about how the colonized, oppressed, colonized feel political agency for the first time. But if you read chapters 2, 3, and 4, you know that it's a distortion of what real political agency and real liberation can bring. So it is very clear, even from the arch theorist of violence, that violence doesn't bring individual freedom or move to a better life, that you have to do it with politics, and you have to do it with making decisions about politics. And that, I'm going to draw this to a close. October 7th for Israel was called a mechtal. Mechtal is a word that was sort of used heavily for for the failures in 1973. But the failures in 1973 pale in comparison to the failures of October 7th. Because in 1973, no fighting occurred on Israeli land, and there were no massive evacuations, as there still are from the north and south in Israel during that war, which lasted 3 weeks. But mechtal is an interesting word. Mechtal is, in a sense, you can use it to mean screw up, but it probably should be translated as a word that I don't want to say, that begins with F and you can imagine ends in K. It means to suck out the life. In Hamlet's famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, there's a form of hadal is used for not to be. It withdraws the life. And there are only a few textual examples of how you overcome a mechtal. But you have to do something to address, to atone for a mechtal. And we're still waiting for the Israelis and the Israeli political leadership to sort out how this mechtal is going to be dealt with, who's going to be held responsible, who's going to be continued in power. It's very important. The army, as of now, has done a magnificent tactical job, but it cannot make Israel safe without a political arrangement. And the political arrangement has to probably involve bringing back the Palestinian Authority into Gaza on some level, and move the Palestinian Authority into a way that gives them an incentive to move away from violence and rage into politics. That's really the only choice that Israel has at this point. And thus far, the leadership hasn't yet accepted it, but I assume eventually it will. Let me stop there. I say I could go on forever, and open it up to questions.
Donna, thank you so much. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, We would like to invite members of the audience to drop comments, questions that they would like to ask from our speaker, and I will do my best to put them together and frame them into a discussion. Donna, if I could start maybe the conversation, I would like to raise an issue that very much relates to the context and everything that you so eruditely and eloquently discussed. But I would like to ask maybe pointedly, and that is the global, for lack of a better word, resurgence, but almost a very violent, very sudden resurgence of anti-Semitism in the wake of what happened. How do we understand the connection between this very, very rapid spread of anti-Semitism almost the day after Israel was attacked on October 7th? We saw synagogue buildings being attacked and burnt in North Africa, and very, very quickly things deteriorated and spread like wildfire. So how do we understand the relationship between Jewish communities far away from Israel and October 7th, Zionism, anti-Semitism? So how do we put all of this together?
I know more about the American context here than I do about other places, but the anti-Zionism and hence slash anti-Semitism started to appear when in the last few years, even before October 7th, when you had progressive forces marching and saying we can't include anyone with an Israeli flag or with a, marking herself as a Zionist. So there have been coalitions forming with a kind of anti-Semitism thrust. We're two political scientists. It seems to me when you look at what is going on campus, in some ways we could call it an old-fashioned struggle for power. The attacks against the attacks that are using the Hamas attacks as justification for going after Jewish institutions or Jewish personalities. They're going after institutions where Jews have done very well. If you look at education, if you look at the medical establishment, a cultural establishment, they're going after these institutions to make it uncomfortable for Jews to hold these positions, whatever they're feeling about Israel. And I'm not sure they know what they're feeling about Israel. So if you're embracing the notion that Israel is the avatar of everything that is evil and the source of everything that is evil, anything that you see means you want to highlight the fact that Israel is a Jewish state. And the only way to highlight that in New York is to deface a kosher restaurant or deface a synagogue. And if I could say one thing that is very noticeable, after October 7th, not only did 300,000 Israelis who were traveling all over the world for one reason or another make their way back to the front lines and put themselves in danger, but you had more and more Arabs embracing the state of Israel and fighting for the state of Israel. And also every video I have seen of civil society people packaging food for the soldiers or packaging, uh, uh, giving packages for the evacuees. You see religious Jews and religious Muslims together, working together. So there was an embrace of the notion of Israel as a state, as a Jewish state, not exclusive for Jews, but helping everybody in the state improve their conditions. And I think what the protesters here are trying to express is it's not the state of Israel, it's all embracing diverse state. It's the Jewish part of that state that's wrong.
Thank you, Donna. Another question that I would like to pick up on is one of your suggested solutions or one of the pathways that you plausibly imagine or you see as a solution, long-term solution for this conflict, for the current stage of the conflict, and that is the return in some shape or form of the Palestinian Authority to rule over Gaza. How do you think Israeli society, its different segments, and of course you can cut Israeli society differently, ideologically, left, right, center, and its different shades, Hiloni, Dati, secular, religious, and its many different segments. How do you see a consensus, an Israeli consensus emerge as we go ahead in time on that solution, or do you think, or do you see some deep conversation and deep soul searching on what the solution to this Mahdal can actually be, and maybe one other follow-up question after that.
So for sure, it will break up the coalition. You won't have Smotrich, the religious Zionists, and Ben Gvir. You're not going to have Jewish power, and you're not going to have those people in the coalition. I think somebody has to explain, and many people have in the Hebrew press, but in the political leadership has to explain. Israel is confronted with several choices, all of them bad, or none of them ideal. So what you have to do is, I think, select the least awful. And what you don't want and what you can't have is the army forever there managing this. The cost would be horrific, and it won't be able to, the cost in human life and economics would be horrific. Netanyahu seems to want to develop this port and get various members of the United Arab Emirates and the Abraham Accords, America to back this both financially and otherwise. But you can't do this without an Arab buy-in into this. And I don't think the Arabs, thus far, the Arabs don't seem to be willing to buy in. And even Qatar, which is willing to pay for it, wants to use a contracting firm, says it would do it if it can use its contracting firm, which is wrapped in many, many different ways around Hamas. I mean, the success of what Israel is doing now will depend on what it leaves behind in Gaza. And if it leaves behind chaos, that's not going to be a success for the country or for anyone else. And so what it has to do is produce as much as possible some orderly system there that protects it, gives it gives its civilians protection, but is less than ideal, certainly from the point of view of the most, the religious Zionism, the people who want to settle the whole land of Israel, Judea and Samaria, are going to be very disappointed. But Israel, for all its power and for all its growth and for all its success and achievements, doesn't have the manpower to keep all of that land. That's very clear now. You can't do it with drones, and you can't do it with just high tech. You need human beings, and human beings also have to work. You don't want to have simply a fortress society.
Donna, I know that we are dangerously running to the end of the hour that we asked you to give us. But if you permit me, there are two other questions that I would like to raise, and maybe I will ask them together, and then you'll decide how you want to answer them together, separately, or not at all. It's of course entirely up to you. One of them has to do with the age-old strategy of the periphery, or the looking at, and this is how we used to teach, of course, one particular way in which Israel was historically trying to make peace with states farther away on its foreign policy periphery in order to better the relations eventually with those that are closer to its core. And certainly that was the way in which those kinds of discussions were very prevalent when we were debating and discussing and trying to make sense of the Abraham Accords framework and architecture. As one of my Israeli guests in my Israeli politics class argued, it was always going to be outside in, right? So if we can only make peace with the larger, strong Arab states, Egypt, Syria would have been, of course, and there were attempts. Certainly Saudi Arabia, prior to October 7th, it seemed that deal, the normalization with Saudi Arabia might be on the doorsteps. Was it all wrong? Did October 7th somehow indicate that thinking about peace with the Arab Middle East through outside in was the wrong way, or was Hamas, and was this just a singularity that we couldn't have, Israel couldn't have, scholars couldn't have been prepared for? This is my one question. And the other question, I will ask it much more briefly, the relationship between the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, and Israel. How do you see October 7th and its aftermath? Strain, test, or challenge the relationship between Israel and the diaspora, which, again, for now several decades, we have been always thinking in terms of distancing, getting farther and farther apart from each other, politically, socially, culturally, and so forth. Donna, those two questions, and in as few or as many minutes as you can give us.
Israel can't avoid the Palestinian issue, whether it comes from in the periphery or whatever, because the Palestinian issue, the way I used to try to explain it to my students was, it's like that old game of musical chairs. When the music stops, you don't want to have where are the Palestinians going to be? Jordan has as many as it can handle. Egypt doesn't want them. Syria doesn't want them. Lebanon doesn't want them. They want the Palestinians to be Israel's problem. So it doesn't matter which Arab state you broker some agreement, ultimately you're going to come up back to that issue. There are too many Palestinians to just totally ignore them. And there's a regional issue going on with Iran that is always going to drive up the violence. So there's kind of a joke in Israel, which you probably know, that Zionism created two nationalisms, Jewish and Palestinian. Now Israel is going to have to figure out a way to create another state, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. It's going to have to give incentives to Palestinian groups that have never had power to see that there's an advantage to coexistence, to interacting politically instead of confronting in violence. Confronting Israel in violence just does terrible things to Palestinian society. So that's one thing. There was a book published last year or 2 years ago in Hebrew and English about how the Jewish state is so strong it doesn't need the diaspora. The diaspora is so weak. There's intermarriage. There's this. There's that. People are more interested in climate change. I think I wrote a review of that book and I said, "Don't write us off yet." And I do think there are important interactions. Both, Zionism was established because people thought that the Jews were in an apocalyptic situation. There was immigration, there were families stretched and broken apart. And Zionism was there to put things back together, to take the brokenness and say, we can manage it. We'll make mistakes, but we can manage it together. And I think that's still true.
Donna, thank you so much. Thank you for spending this hour with us. Thank you for fielding the questions. Thank you for giving us this magisterial overview on the deep historical and intellectual roots of some of the trends and some of the developments that we are witnessing on our campuses, that we are witnessing in North America, and of course also in the Middle East, in Israel, and really in all the different slices of the world that we are engaging and connecting with. Very, very grateful, Donna, that you spend this time with us, and we certainly look forward to another time when hopefully you can also get to be able to visit us in person. Montreal actually is really beautiful, and it can be warm even in March. We just have to plan it accordingly.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And dear friends, before I would let you go and before we would close the screen, I do want to remind you to please join us a week from today on March 25th. We will have our next event at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. It will be at noon hour, a book launch, a fresh, hot off the press publication by Dr. Guy Ziv from the American University. The title of his book, which just came out with Cambridge University Press, is Netanyahu Against the Generals, The Battle for Israel's Future. And we are going to be spreading information about a draw for early participants in that event, but you do have to come in person in order to participate in the draw for some copies of the book. I also would like to say a huge thank you to Corey Newman, who is our social media and communications and technological guru, and here at the Institute, without whose able assistance, events such as this wonderful engagement with Donna, we would not have been able to bring to you. So Corey, thank you again for everything that you do. And we look forward to continuing our bringing more and more exciting programming to your screens and also to the classrooms. Donna, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Hope to see you in Prague.
Very much looking forward. Bye.
Bye-bye.